Hello and welcome back to The Joy of Carving. In this video, I'm going to take you through how you can carve this little whittled bird. Two of my favourite things about this project is you don't need to have a specific type of wood to carve this bird with. One of the things I do is I often take nature walks and I'll collect foraged woods and branches that have fallen off trees, and you can carve the bird out of those collected sticks. And secondly, is this project is fantastic for both beginners and intermediate carvers. If you're more of an adept carver, then you can really continue with this and refine the shape and add further details, but it's great for both beginners and intermediate carvers as well. So get yourself comfortable, get yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and let's begin the joy of carving. The only items we'll need for this project are the blank cutout of the bird and our piece of driftwood to mount the bird on, the brass rods, which will be the legs of the bird, and finally our whittling knife. One of the fantastic things about this project is that it doesn't require many components, although because we're working to a smaller scale than we were on the Scandi Dala horse, this is going to be slightly more complicated. Just a bit of self-promotion, but I have been making these little leather thumb sheaths, which are just great little added protection. If you do want one of these, they are available on my website. So as with every wood carving project that we start, I'm starting with a rough cutout of the form here. I'm whittling this little bird out of basswood, but you could use any type of wood that you want. So we want to begin by rounding all of those square edges. And the key here is to ensure that the flow of that wood grain is going horizontally across the bird. So I'm starting by rounding that back, and as always I'm going down the hill and carving down the hill, because remember, if you did watch the Scandi horse video, we always want to carve down the hill so that we're not lifting that grain pattern up and tearing the wood, so we're carving down the back of the bird here. I wanted to just give you an example here of what it looks like and how it feels to carve against the grain. And you can see the result straight away that when I'm carving against the grain, it really wants to tear and pull the wood away. And then of course when we carve with the grain, you can see how much smoother it is there. So again, as I said in the last video, that's something that you're going to feel over time. You'll start to feel when the wood wants to tear. And we're just continuing on with rounding the chest of the bird there, just repeating the steps that we did when we carved the back of the bird. And I just want to quickly point out now, you can see what happened there when I went against the flow of the grain. That chunk of wood just split. It's not too much of a problem at that stage, because we still need to remove a lot of wood, but when you're on the later stages, when you want to remove less and less wood, just be mindful that you're not going to tear out a chunk of the wood there by going against the grain. Now we're carving the head of the bird, so it's just a case here of whittling either side of the bird and stopping periodically just to check the thickness. We're rounding it. At this point, you don't want to start making that beak really small. We want to save that beak till last, because if we make it really small at this point, there's a chance that we could snap off that beak. So it's just a case of rounding the head, making sure it's thinner. We want it to be smaller and thinner than the body, the wings as well. Now that we have the rounded shape of the bird, we can start to mark out where we want the wings to be. The best way to do this is to imagine the shape of the wings in the shape of a heart. So the centre of the heart is going to be directly behind the head, and I'm just sketching out the rough sort of heart shape here of where the wings are going to be. As you progress with your carving journey, you may want to experiment. You may want to carve the wings so that they're spread open slightly. You may want to carve it so that the head is tucked under the wings slightly. What's fantastic about this project is if you have the fundamentals down for this bird carving, you can translate them into other different birds as well. So if you can carve this, you can carve an owl, you can carve a penguin. They will all follow the same fundamental forms. What we're going to do now is we're going to use the tip of the knife to carefully score where we've made the pencil marks. So I'm using the tip of the knife to just score those lines, and what that's going to do is that's going to create a trench for a stop cut, and we're going to carve into that line. So you can see there I'm carving into that line that I'm making, because we want those wings to have the appearance that they're thicker than the body, that they're sticking out further than the actual body. I just want to quickly point out here as well, because we're carving such a narrow valley there and we're using the very tip of the knife to score those lines, just be really mindful about where you're keeping your fingertips while you're holding the bird as you're whittling. Because we're so close to the knife blade, it's likely that we might slip, we might apply too much pressure, so just be really careful and cautious about where the knife is and its proximity to your fingertips. And that's how it's going to look once we've done one of those wings. So again, you can go even deeper if you want to. I might go a little bit deeper here, just so it looks like the wing is sticking out a little bit more. But you're going to repeat the process on the other side, and you're going to proceed with carving the center of those wings, that line that I'm marking there. And it's exactly the same process. I'm going to use the tip of the knife to score that line, and then I'm going to carve that valley with the tip of the knife again. So just use the same amount of caution, because we're working so closely with the tip of the blade there. I just want to quickly point out again as well that because we're using the very tip of the blade to score those lines, we don't want to use that much pressure. We don't want to use much pressure because we're so close to our fingers, so we don't want to slip, but also we don't want to snap the tip of that blade as well, which can happen if you're using too much force. The very tip of the actual knife can snap. When you're happy with the wing shapes, you're happy with the depth, you can move on to marking out the position of the tail. So it's a very simple V shape for that tail. The technique for carving the tail is really, really simple. So it's literally a case of we're making a valley, we're making a V shape on either side of that tail there. So it's a case of carving one side, then switching to the other, carving another. You're switching back and forth between both of those sides until you get the required depth that you need. As I'm carving that tail as well, I'm starting to round the bottom of the belly of the bird, so I'm starting to actually make it look like the belly ends and the tail begins. But it's exactly the same technique, just carving both sides, so under the belly and then where the tail meets, until you get a good shape of where that tail meets the belly. The crucial part when we're finishing the tail, when we're carving the last piece of the tail, is to apply very, very little pressure. Depending on how thin you've gone with that tail, if you apply too much pressure, you could risk snapping it off. And the final part is just taking that beak into a really nice pointed form. Just remember to be mindful about how that wood feels as you're carving it. Are you carving with or against the grain? And that's how the finished bird looks. So I've done a little bit of sanding here. As always, I don't like to do too much. I like to retain that rustic, whittled appearance to the bird. But you can sand yours as much as you want. The only thing left to do now is to mark the position of where the legs are going to be, drill those holes, glue and attach the brass rods, which will be the legs in place, and attach it to the driftwood piece. And there's the finished bird. I absolutely love making these little whittled birds. I think they make such cute little quick projects, but you can put them on jewellery boxes, you can make little Scandi mobiles with them, but they just make fantastic little projects, and you can carve a whole bunch of these in a day if you wanted to. But they really do make really, really cute little projects. I really hope that video was interesting and useful for you. Thank you so much for joining me here at The Joy of Carving. Look out for the next video, and you can support the channel by liking and subscribing, but thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy carvings!